Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and it is titled Public Lands, Public Lens, Establishing Public Protected Spaces. And it is from Andrew Jackson's Hermitage and the Theodore Roosevelt Center. So the Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. And it is a free educational program we put on from January through April. And this is just a reminder that by being a part of this webinar, you agree to be recorded, streamed, broadcasted, and archived as a part of the program series. And we do keep copies of all of our webinars, all of our programs on our YouTube page, and you can go find them there after the programs are over. So we have archives from all of our past programs. And we're so excited to have you all here today. We want you to participate as much as possible. And we just want to remind you of a few guidelines we have for our digital tools. So the main way we're going to participate is using the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen, looks like a little message bubble. And with the chat box, you're just going to want to make sure all of your comments are on topic to what the presenters are talking about. Another way we can participate is if you would like to be promoted to a panelist, and then we can have you turn your camera on if you would like to be on camera. And we also encourage you to rename yourself as what you would like to be called by. So just make sure your name is correct. And then if you need help with that, you can drop that in the chat and we can help you rename yourself. Thanks again so much for joining us today. This is our website if you would like to register for future programs or just find out more about the program. And yeah, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters so they can get started. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for that, Casey, and thank you for being here, everyone. I sure appreciate being asked to be involved with this and appreciate talking to all you students. It really is always a great time. I'm Dr. William Hanser. I am the Social Media and Education Coordinator here at the Theodore Roosevelt Center in Dickinson, North Dakota. Our other presenter, Erin Adams from Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, is running a little late, but will be joining us shortly to give her portion of the presentation. Our presentation today is called Public Lands, Public Lens, the President and the National Park System. So we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about why presidents might have protected public lands and how they protected public lands, the legal mechanisms by which they did this. And we're going to talk about the connections between the president and protecting public lands and between Presidents Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt, the sort of similar ideas that they may have had about protecting land. But to get started first, we have a little poll for you. And that's going to pop up a short little 3-question poll. And the first question is, have you been to a national park? Yes or no? So a lot of people have, but a lot of people also haven't. And if you have been, what part of the United States was that park in? And finally, that last question will be, if you had to pay for your visit to a national park, how much would that visit be worth to you? So we'll give you a few moments to answer those questions in the poll. We've got first couple answers starting to come in here. Very good. Couple of participants have been to national parks in the West and the South, mostly. Interesting. Of course, most of the national parks are somewhere in the West. David asked, what if I had visited some in most regions? Well, that's very lucky, and I'm happy for you. I think the best thing would just be to choose where most of the ones you've been, or to pick whatever answer you feel fits best. We didn't think to have an option for multiple regions. David did do that. Very good, David. Thank you. And everyone said that if they had to pay for that visit, it would be worth $100. Well, that's a good number. And of course, luckily, we don't have to pay $100 to visit the national park sites because our tax dollars do go to support them. So that's very nice. But it's good to know that you found your visits valuable in that way. But everyone has participated, so we will go ahead and end this poll. And the final results is you've all been to national parks, been in the West and the South, and paid $100. So very good. And with that, we will move on to talking about President Theodore Roosevelt. And with Theodore Roosevelt, we're going to talk about who should have rights to public lands and rights to the resources on those public lands. Theodore Roosevelt was someone who was very concerned with conserving natural resources. So that, meant the water and the trees and the air and everything in public lands. And of course, the animals and plants that lived on those lands. But he didn't completely want to stop anyone from using them at all. He wanted to use land and use the resources on land responsibly. But before we talk about how and why he protected certain kinds of land and certain amounts of land, we're going to talk a little bit about who he was and why he felt it was important to protect land. So Theodore Roosevelt believed in an idea called the strenuous life. This was a phrase he used a lot, that he used in writings and speeches and books, et cetera, about really a hearty physical exercise and being outside and being active. That was very, very important to him, and he felt it was important to the country. And so this happens in part because when he was a small child, he was very sickly. He was very smart, very good at reading and studying and like that, but his body was weak. And in particular, he suffered from very, very bad asthma, which is easier to treat now with inhalers and medications, but it was very hard to treat asthma when he was a little boy in the 19th century. And so his father told him that he had to make his body, that he had to get strong and do exercise and get himself better so that both his mind and his body were strong. And so he did that. You see that picture of him there as a little boy, and then that picture of him in the sort of shorts and bare feet and the cap, that's his rowing outfit when he was at Harvard College. And then that picture of him with the axe standing among the boulders, that's an ice axe from when he was mountaineering in Europe. He went to Europe on his first honeymoon, and he climbed mountains in Italy and in France, et cetera, et cetera. And so he was always doing something very active. That picture of him there jumping a fence on his horse is from the time he was president. So he was still being active even then in the early 1900s when he's president. He rides horses very, very often. He does jujitsu in the White House, even all kinds of exciting physical activity. But physical activity was just one part of this equation of why he wants to preserve the great outdoors. And we'll go to the next slide and talk about the great outdoors that he preserves. So as president, Theodore Roosevelt will protect 230 million acres of land. And much of this land has important physical features on it. So pictures here, he's visiting the redwood trees in California. He's visiting Yosemite National Park and Yellowstone National Park. And these places, of course, have these really, really remarkable physical features, right, that we don't all see every day in the places that we live. And Theodore Roosevelt believed it was really important to protect those kinds of places so that we could all enjoy them. And he is promoted in this. These ideas are promoted to him by other famous naturalists, they were called, people who lived in and studied the outdoors. John Muir, you may have heard of. John Burroughs, you may have heard of. These men were sort of part of his group of advisors who helped him to decide which lands to protect and how to protect them. And it's important to note that this is not just national parks that he does this with. There are a lot of other different kinds of nationally protected sites that he uses. He will create the National Wildlife Refuge System, and he will create the National Monument System and other ways to protect land beyond just the parks being the most famous kind. But he does create 5 national parks. The ones he creates are Crater Lake in Oregon, Wind Cave in South Dakota, Sully's Hill in North Dakota, which is now a wildlife preserve, Mesa Verde in Colorado, and Platte, Oklahoma, which is now part of the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. So a couple of those are not national parks anymore, but they are still federally protected. He will create 18 national monuments, dozens of national forests and wildlife preserves, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really important to him. The physical features are also not the only reason that he wants to protect this land. He wants to protect the animals in much of this land as well, most importantly, birds. And he becomes known as Roosevelt, friend of the birds. There's even a short documentary that is made not long after he passes away about his important relationship to birds. And this starts when he's a child. When he's doing these exercises and other physical activity outdoors, he's also making scientific observations. And he is drawing animals that he sees, and he is writing down, scientific observations about them, their size, where they live, what they eat, etc. And he really starts to write, his own sort of natural history books, like you might find in a science library, all on his own while he's outdoors. And so from the time he's a kid, he really, really loves birds. But birds need protecting while he is president. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, birds were being hunted really, really heavily for their feathers. Some types of birds were being hunted to extinction or near extinction to gather their feathers. To the point that the feathers of a snowy egret were worth twice as much as gold per ounce. So they were really, really a big deal. Mostly so that they could be used in fashion, in clothing. You see this picture where there are feathers in women's hats. That was really the big thing at the time. And so in order to keep birds from going extinct, certain kinds of birds, Theodore Roosevelt will decide he needs to protect the places that they live and protect them from being hunted. But he has to figure out the best way to do this. So he has to think about how and why am I able to protect these lands as the president of the United States. And so if we'll go to that next slide, please, Shohor, thank you. So these men, like I was talking about, John Muir, John Burroughs, and some of these other men are telling him you need to protect this. And so he starts to get a group, his cabinet of advisors together to figure out how to protect the land. And so he asks who owns the land, how the land is owned. And it turns out that in Florida, Pelican Island, where they most need some protection at this time, is already federally owned. The federal government has already laid claim to this land in Florida that he wants to protect. And so then he asks his people if there are any laws that stop him from protecting this land. And he says, they say to him, no, there are no laws against it. And so he famously replies, I so declare it. He just invents this national wildlife refuge system out of thin air, or seemingly out of thin air. We'll actually talk about how there's some predecessors to it. But he invents this national wildlife refuge system to protect the birds because he can. And that's a really important note. Yes, protecting the land for the land's sake and the animal's sake was important to him, but that was not the only part of the equation here. He also was doing this as a form of presidential power. So he says that he subscribes to the Jackson-Lincoln theory of the presidency when he writes about this. And what he means is that Presidents Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln before him also did things that were new, gave the president sort of new powers and new abilities to do things, as long as the Constitution didn't prohibit it, as long as there were no laws against it. And so Theodore Roosevelt believed that the president should do things for the public good and had a duty to do those things as long as there were no laws stopping him from doing it. And so that was a really important part of why Theodore Roosevelt creates all of these public lands, these national monuments, national forests, et cetera, et cetera. And another important part of this, though, is deciding, again, who should get to use land in the United States in general. And so there's a question of public versus private use of land that Roosevelt wrestles a lot with during his lifetime. Even before he's president, when he is ranching in North Dakota, He is actually a squatter on lands in North Dakota. He doesn't own any land there. He's using land that belongs to other people that they're just not enforcing their claim on. And so are the other ranchers in that area that he is at in North Dakota. But this public grazing land for animals was important to ranching. And so this system kind of worked. And that's the way Roosevelt wanted it to be. He wanted to have small homesteads of land rather, or to have public lands that everyone could use. What he really didn't want was big corporate use, because once you start doing things like drilling for oil and cutting down trees, you're creating, pollution and getting rid of the resources. And if you're doing it just to make money, you don't care if it all goes away. And that was the way he thought corporations would operate. And so he really wanted to protect these lands that the federal government already had a claim to from any sort of private development. That was one of his really big concerns. But it was so that everyone could use it, and because the president could make it so. But there's another problem. A big part of this is the public and private lands are for whom? Who is it that actually is allowed to use these lands and able to use them, and who has claim to them? So the lands that the federal government laid claim to had already, of course, been claimed for many centuries by Native American tribal nations. They were the stewards of places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and many of these national forests and monuments that President Roosevelt creates. And they were already being moved off of land anyway by many sort of legal systems. In particular, the one while Roosevelt is president is the Indian allotment system created by the Dawes Act, it was called. And this system breaks up the tribal nations and their lands into small little homesteads like Anglo-Americans had been doing. And it forced people to, instead of live on communal lands in the cultures that they were accustomed to take up farming, often on lands that were not even suitable for it. But again, it broke up their lands and took lands then to be sold to the highest bidder that was left over after they broke up the reservations. They also took land for federally protected national parks and monuments and forests. One author estimates that 85 million acres of lands that had been controlled by Native Americans were moved into the national forest system. So the question of who it is that actually is the public and is being able to use and access this land in the way they feel is appropriate is not as simple, perhaps, as we would like. And in particular, the man you see here with his family, Black Elk, actually says, sorry, let me find the quote in my notes here. He says that Americans and the federal government had made little islands for Native Americans, and that those islands were getting smaller and smaller. So they felt that a place that they had a claim and a right to was being taken from them. But President Roosevelt really had no problem with this. He actually said the phrase in 1892, he said, "This continent had to be won, and we need not waste our time in dealing with anyone who would have left this continent to the public domain." So there's a real sort of contradiction in what is considered public or not. But with that, let's use that as some connective tissue to move to our second half of our presentation on President Andrew Jackson. First, we do have another set of polling questions for you. Another set of 3 questions. So the first is that, did you know that Andrew Jackson was the president who created the first public lands for a park? That's something we're going to talk about here in a moment that you may not have realized. I certainly did not realize it before I became involved with this presentation. And then, do you know which president usually gets credit for creating the first national park? There's 3 choices there, and we'll see what you all say. And where was the first official national park created? So we've got some answers coming in. People did not know that Andrew Jackson was the president who created the first public lands. Oh, one person did. Yes, very good. Always like to see when people know some of those interesting things that not everyone does. Several people saying Theodore Roosevelt usually gets credit for creating the first national park. He did not. He created several of them, and he did, like we said, created those national monuments, national wildlife refuges. The first official national park, though, was in Yellowstone, you're correct, but it was created in 1872 by President Ulysses S. Grant. But long before that, that Yellowstone first official national park, decades before, Andrew Jackson set aside the first publicly federally protected lands. And so that is what we're going to talk about next. And now that the answers for the poll are in, I will turn things over to Aaron Adams from Andrew Jackson's Hermitage.
All right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hansard, and welcome to everybody who's with us today. So you all have learned a lot about Theodore Roosevelt, about his goals for the parks, but Andrew Jackson had a little bit of a different view in his mind. I think we heard how strong a spirit of conservation Theodore Roosevelt went in with, how much he thought that people should get outside and use that as a way to be strong and healthy. And yes, David, I'm in a car. I'm running between meetings today. So yes, you are seeing a beautiful sunny day in Nashville, Tennessee. So Andrew Jackson did set aside the first lands for public use in this way, but the way he came about it and the reasons that led him to it are very different than Theodore Roosevelt's in many ways. So let's walk through them a little bit and we'll see what some of those connections are. All right, so you guys remember that the Louisiana Purchase had been bought by Congress for the United States in the early 1800s, 1803. And Thomas Jefferson was the president who was really pushing for the acquisition of Louisiana Territory. And when you look at the map, the modern map that you're seeing on your screen, you can see exactly where that Louisiana Territory was. All right, now that's huge. We're talking about millions of acres of land that's come into the United States. Lewis and Clark, the more famous, the Corps of Discovery, they were given a specific task, which was to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. So they were meant to go from Missouri up through the upper and western stretches of Louisiana and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. All right, so we know this story about Lewis and Clark, but there's a lot of the Louisiana Territory that's now left out of Lewis and Clark's explorations because it was not necessary for getting them to the Pacific. And I'm specifically thinking about places like the upper part of Louisiana, or the state of Louisiana rather, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, sort of that bottom south, southern sort of border of the Louisiana Territory there. So President Jefferson and others began to form expeditions to send people towards this area so that they would be able to explore it much in the way that Lewis and Clark had done. And the orders that Thomas Jefferson gives to William Dunbar were to map the Washita River all the way from where it confluences with the Red River and empties out into the Mississippi River, all the way from that point as far northwest till they got to the springs. And if you look at the map, the historic map, you'll see on the far right side of the image the confluence with the Mississippi, and on the far left side of the image you'll just see it marked the springs. Okay, like everybody knows what these springs are. Like there's no other springs between Hot Springs and the Mississippi River. So this is what William Dunbar and others are sent to map to find the beginnings of those hot springs. All right, so if you'll go one more for me. Okay, so what are hot springs? What are these springs that Jefferson wants to make sure we've explored as far as and to see what can be done with them or about them and what the natures are? So let's talk about the science of the hot springs for just a second. So you can see in front of you, I have a physical map of what today is the state of Arkansas. Describe that to me in the chat, just a little bit. Describe to me, what is this looking like? Like what does this physical map give a sense for you of the land in Arkansas? I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. So as far as I'm concerned, Arkansas is flat, 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 and nothing but like fields where crops are growing. Is that the whole state though? What do you think? Mountains to the north, plains to the south. Yep. Natalie, good job. I think that explains it very well. And when you've studied mountains, you know that mountains inevitably have valleys, right? So there's high points, there's low points. The overall elevation of the ground is going upward. So the state of Arkansas has a really interesting geology and has a really interesting combination of geological and geographical figures. What this means then is it is kind of a perfect environment for creating these mineral hot springs. All right. So look at the map there to the right, where you've got the rain, where it shows like the rain cycle, shows how these springs are getting formed. Now, if you have studied the water cycle in science, you know that there's a pattern to this, right? Water comes from the sky. It feeds into the ground. That water then runs into groundwater sources like aquifers. Sometimes it forms springs, which is where the water then comes back up to the surface. Usually those springs are either sort of tepid or a little chilly to the touch or to the taste. But there's also a phenomenon of geothermal springs where they're actually heated water, and the heated water comes back to the surface of the earth. One of the most famous geothermal figures in the United States, of course, are geysers, like out at Yellowstone or out at Yosemite. Old Faithful is the geyser that I'm thinking of. But when you look at the picture, just the modern picture of like these rocks and this waterfall and these pine trees, I think it kind of pulls all this together for me anyway. So you're seeing, waterfalls, and it's not just soaking into dirt all the way down. It's actually running through layers of different types of stone and rock. Okay. And so those stones and rock having a high mineral content, all of that mineral content is going into the water, and then it goes into the geothermic system and then back out as springs. All right. So the hot springs themselves there were many of them. By the time Jackson approves this as a protected land, there are at least 47 that they know about, but there seems to have been a lot more than this. And the first people to describe the hot springs, the Europeans at least, were the French and the Spanish explorers in the region. They talk about these places where the ground is so warm, the water, just bubbles up from it, already ready for the soup pot, for the bathtub. That these tend to be the kinds of places where people gather. So they notice that Native American communities use these as trading posts. They become locations for medical treatment. They become locations for commerce and business to take place, for politics to take place. So the hot springs in Arkansas had formed this very natural sort of community around it. So you have this really unique and sensitive geological formation that makes this happen. And then people interpret that as a place where others are going to gather. Okay. So it's a really interesting, I think, combination of how human beings see the earth and the resources of the earth, and that we use these natural kind of phenomena to build communities around. All right. Yeah, thank you. So what do you do when you have a hot spring? Okay, you could do lots of things with it. You go into the chat though and tell me what you would do if you stumbled across a hot spring. Are you going to buy it for private property? Are you going to invite others to come use it? Could you build a business around it? What are you going to do? Build a resort. All right. Do you want to run the resort though, Natalie? Do you want to be the person who's going to clean all the bathrooms and nope. You just want to own it. I get it. All right. So we've got build a resort and owning it. What else have we got? Well, one idea that comes up quite a bit, and it came up to the people of the past as well, medical purposes. Natalie, you're absolutely right. So when you look at the images in front of us, the one that's there on the left side is an 18th century drawing of a hot spring in England. You might have heard about it. It was called Bath. The Romans had known about it. They used it as a medical facility. And so that's how people continued to use Bath well into the 18th and 19th centuries. And they would do what was called taking the waters. So it wasn't a bath. You weren't bathing in it. You weren't soaking your feet in it. you actually drank it. So businesses would spring up that claim to have the purest mineral waters coming directly out of these hot springs, and you could pay your fee and drink it like you would at a coffee shop. Okay. So you get your hot cup of mineral water and you drink it. And people would spend their vacations doing this. People swore by the waters that if you drank so much per day, all of your ills would just go away. Thanks, Natalie, for pointing out my puns. I appreciate that. um, so this was already a common thought. So then, of course, people are coming to America here in the New World. Springs were known everywhere. Right here in Nashville, where we are, there's one just a couple of miles down the road from us, right? So these began to get more and more known. All right. So why Arkansas, though? Why hot springs territory in Arkansas? By the 1820s, enough people are moving into Arkansas that it becomes a territory. And remember that the Constitution has there's a very clear path to follow for territories that are trying to move into statehood. Okay, so it takes some time to make this happen. They have to let the population grow. They have to demonstrate to Congress that there's a plan, for how we're going to run this state and what the state's going to be like and look like and what resources are going to be available to this state, right? So over the course of the 1820s, there are people in Arkansas Territory who are working very hard at getting Arkansas added as a state. Okay, so one of the resources that they are pushing forward pretty strongly is the presence of the hot springs. And the way in which the hot springs area had already been developed for routes of commerce, trading with native peoples, trading with Europeans that were in the region. It's already a center of news and information. People know about hot springs, which means they know that hot springs is easily served by postal services, by news services. So this is a community that already has sprung up with resources to make it a real town, if you think about it that way. So the document that you're seeing here on this page is the bill in which Hot Springs is established as a federal area of federally protected lands, rather. So I've got a few questions for you about it, just real quick. I know that writing is probably a little hard to read, but I'm really hoping that you'll notice at least two things out of it. So going into the chat, friends, who wrote the bill? Who signed it into a law? Why did he sign it into a law? And was Andrew Jackson really all that interested in hot springs? What are your thoughts? If you can spring or seep your way into the chat, that'll be great. Okay, well, knowing it's a little hard to read, then let me go ahead and jump in there for you, and then you just keep looking. All right, so let's tackle that first one right there. Who wrote the bill? This one should be the easiest one because it's in the giant black letters. And even though they're pretty swirly, you should be able to read that it says Congress of the United States. Thanks, Natalie. So you should be able to see that it says Congress of the United States. They write the bill, but who signs it? The rule is Congress can propose the legislation. It comes down to the president to be signed in order for it to go into effect. And that's the little red box at the bottom, a little faded, but that is Andrew Jackson's signature right there at the bottom. All right. Why? I propose that there's two reasons that Jackson does this. One has been its capabilities, right? The appeal that this can become a center of business, of politics, of news and information, of medical practice, of just a community with businesses in it that exist. I also propose to you that Jackson is very excited about getting Arkansas brought into the Union as a state. Jackson, during his presidency, only adds 2 states to the Union. One is Arkansas and one is Michigan. And both of those states come in towards the end of Jackson's presidency. So I'm wondering, and this is where I need to do a little research, I'm wondering if Jackson was getting he didn't want to miss the opportunity to add a state. Does that make sense? So he had, he's gone his entire 2 terms and he's down to the last year and a half. And now he's really trying to finish up on Arkansas and Michigan and get them added as states. But here's what he says, or I'm sorry, here's what the bill says. Because what's going to happen as a result of this bill is a little uncertain at the moment. And the bill does not tell us a lot of details. So I want to read this to you and then let's break it down. It says, the hot springs in Arkansas Territory, together with 4 sections of land, including said springs, as near the center thereof as may be, shall be reserved for the future disposal of the United States and shall not be entered, located, or appropriated for any other purpose whatever. Okay, so think about all the purposes that you might have, that a community might have to access land. Okay, maybe they're growing, the population's growing, they want to build more houses. Maybe the land that's held in reserve, maybe it's better farmland than the land that they have around them. And so that would, help people be able to feed themselves better, take care of their communities better. What if they discovered some other sort of natural resources on them? What if there was oil underneath that land? Arkansas is known for its diamond mines. Who knew that's Arkansas? What if they began discovering diamond mines all underneath, all in this land? I mean, so the idea is, why are we holding land for the future disposal of the United States? Okay, so here's my thought, and I think Theodore Roosevelt, and we can address this in the Q&A if we need to make this a little clearer. But I think Theodore Roosevelt felt it too, that all the land should not be in the hands of people. That it was fine for people to own land. People have families to feed. They have families to take care of. They need to keep a roof over their heads. But just maybe all of the land that's in the possession that is in the United States, maybe a good bit of that needs to be held by the federal government. Who knows what the nation of the future might look like, what they might need to use that land for or not. I think they also saw it as a way of not letting, it's preservation. It's not letting resources get out of hand. And in Theodore Roosevelt's way, I think he saw that more scientifically than Andrew Jackson would have seen it, without a doubt. Jackson never went to hot springs, so he didn't have like a personal tie to it. He did not have a sense of its very specific resources that he wanted to make sure it had. I think partly he was just trying to make Arkansas Territory happy and keep pushing things on towards statehood. So I have a lot of questions for Jackson about this whole process, why he would have done it, why hot springs and why not something else. As Dr. Hansard mentioned, there are many other known places on the East Coast that they could have pointed to and said, oh no, we need to preserve this, right? The Everglades, the Smoky Mountains, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Like, there's some really sensitive historic and geographical parts of our country that anybody could have pointed to and said, if we're going to save things, that's where we need to start. So it's always been curious to me why he started with hot springs. All right. Would you go just one more for me? Thank you. All right. So what does the bill do? The bill protects the hot springs, but like we said, it doesn't give a lot of very specific instructions about how it is to protect it, or protected from, or what it is supposed to be protected from. So of course, businessmen began flooding in the area, opening all those resorts. This was probably Natalie, opening, like throwing up cheap buildings that burned down in fires very easily. They were just doing all this without regard for the landscape around them. They were certainly doing this with no regard for the people who lived initially around hot springs. And of course, that's Native Americans, mostly the Quapaw people. Would you go one more slide for me, Ms. Hammer? Yeah. So how does the bill impact hot springs? Well, one, it begins to bring in a flood of American settlers into the area. And then those settlers begin in turn to push off Native Americans. Now, Native Americans that were original to hot springs are commemorated at hot springs because their names are used for different business names, like Quapaw Baths that you see right here on the left. But certainly the Native Americans were not realizing any of the benefits from the city. They weren't getting, they were not necessarily part of the overall economic improvement of the area. As businesses grew, business owners were finding a way to keep Native Americans more and more out of benefiting from the businesses. And then, of course, it sets up, or it helps to make the argument for the National Park Service. You've already got some protected lands. They all fall under different umbrellas, so is this something that we now need to turn over to the National Park Service? And eventually it is. In the 1960s, I believe, Hot Springs National Park is turned over to the federal government. Turned over to the Park Service at that point, as the Park Service begins to formalize more of its work. So it falls under governmental jurisdiction, but now the government is actually going to make a point of managing the property, not only just saying that they have the right to protect the property. And then finally, what about Andrew Jackson? I don't know. I've got questions. Recently, there was a new site added to the National Park Service under President Obama, and he signed off on adding Fort Monroe in Virginia to the National Park Service as a historic site. Fort Monroe is where Andrew Jackson used to vacation. So on the summers that he did not come home to the Hermitage, but or rather he stayed in Virginia, he would usually take his family out to Fort Monroe, which was just a little island at the time, and he and the family would stay there for their summer vacations. So the bill sets up a number of years of business practices that are not ideal. It allows settlers begin to come into that region. Arkansas achieves statehood, and then it gives a role for the National Park Service to play in how that entire area begins to get shaped. One more, if you will, please. Okay. Yeah, I thought we were at Q&A. So let's go ahead. Friends, if you have got some questions, go ahead and put those in the chat to us. And Dr. Hansard and I will do those.
As those questions come in, just to build on one of those final points you made about managing the land rather than just owning it. It's important to note that one of the things that Theodore Roosevelt does, that 1906 Antiquities Act, is very much about managing those properties, because the act itself allows for the government to give permission for archaeological digs and scientific studies, et cetera, et cetera. So using that foundation that already existed, like you were talking about, to manage that land is, we can see that thread.
Yeah.
Really? Are you in a car, David?
Yes, David, I'm in the car. Been running back and forth. I've been running back and forth between meetings all day, so here I am.
Andrew Jackson probably would have loved to be able to drive a car. Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh my goodness.
If
anybody was ever made for a Corvette, it was Jackson.
Yes, absolutely.
Except he's probably too tall for one. It would take him a minute to get in and get out. What would Roosevelt have driven?
I need to look up. He owned quite a number of cars. Both he and the White House owned cars, but I have to look up. Most of them are cars that, of course, no longer exist. At that time, there was lots of small companies that produced automobiles that are no longer around. But generally, he liked open top vehicles where he could drive fast and feel the wind. And there's a great picture of him driving, and he's got his son Archie, in the back seat, kind of holding tight.
I bet he was a bit of a speed demon.
Yeah.
Natalie said a Bronco. Ha. That was a good one.
Yes. Oh, took me a minute.
Yeah.
Good
nice
job.
I can see Jackson. I can see Roosevelt. I'm sorry. I can see Roosevelt driving like a Hummer, some sort of all-terrain vehicle, probably an open Jeep. That's probably more like that World War II era, postal service kind of Jeep.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that would be probably more like it. So, and David, you had mentioned that you had seen a series of books about people being transported. I wonder if you're talking about the Magic Treehouse series, where modern kids were transported back to other times. No, not that one. Okay.
But that's good too.
I'd have to look that up. I think Benjamin Franklin would be really fascinated with today's world. I think Jackson would feel the need to fix everything. And I don't know about Roosevelt. I think he'd be really interested.
He would be the king of Twitter. He would love to like get his thoughts out on social media, I think, because he is a man who loved the press. Well, he had a love-hate relationship with the press.
Yeah.
He sometimes struggled with what we would now call fake news. When things were put in the paper that he did not agree with, he often spoke out against it. But so he
Yeah.
would definitely be taking advantage of the world's current media landscape, no doubt about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Jackson might as well. I mean, Jackson started his own newspaper, right? So that he had a newspaper that was always friendly to him. It was called the Washington Globe, and it was edited by Francis Blair, who's also the Blair House, where foreign dignitaries stay, is named for him. I think Jackson. I think they would have had to fight to keep Jackson off Twitter in some cases.
Yes.
Just because he tended to get hot, and that's where I think. That's where I think there's a great difference between people of the past and today. It's one thing to know, like, if it's going to take so long for this article to get published or this letter to arrive or something, you've got a minute there to like really get a hold of your thoughts and your actions, right? Or the person at the other end, they might see, let's say Jackson writes a letter to somebody and just criticizes them, tears them to pieces. The person on the other end may not like it, but they might be able to say to themselves, okay, he wrote this 2 weeks ago, and Tom has moved on from then, and kind of just go at it with a little bit more reasonableness, I guess. But if you just, when you pop something on social media, like, it is immediate, you're speaking out of what has just happened. You're speaking out of your feelings, not letting any time lapse where you can really just sort of think things through or come up with a better response than just zinging back at somebody. So I do think Jackson would have to be very, very cautious about that. I think he would probably get himself in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a connection between Jackson and TR. TR tended to get pretty hot sometimes, and he had a tendency to be a name caller. He could get a little hot under the collar about things he really cared about. So that's there's some similarities there.
Yeah, absolutely. Abraham Lincoln would be a YouTuber. That's awesome. What kind of videos would you want to see from Andrew Jackson or Roosevelt if they were YouTubers? What would you want to see from them? I would want a whole how-to series from TR, I think. How to wrestle an alligator,
Sure.
how to ride a bull moose. Not that he rode one. I know that's fake, but
yeah.
how to box, like boxing tips with Theodore Roosevelt.
Sure, instructional videos would be good, and I think just like travel vlogging, basically.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He's out camping in Yosemite or whatever, right? How to zip line on mountain tables. Oh, gee. Well,
wow,
TR
he figured
was the
out.
kind of person who TR was the kind of person who would do just about anything. I mean, this is a man who really relished adventure and might not have balked at that idea.
Yeah. Yep. Jackson, I think if Jackson was on YouTube, I think Jackson would be more suited for a podcast.
Yeah.
But one of those podcasts where the guest never gets to speak,
Yeah.
Or where the host, they'll have questions and they'll allow them to speak, but they'll always be like buffering them into saying what they want them to say. Jackson probably he needs to do it on a podcast so that he can be off screen and holding up cards that say things like "laugh, I'm funny."
Do we have any primary sources, any records about what his voice sounded like? Did anyone write about that?
That is not to my knowledge. When I read his, sometimes you can tell how people say things based on how they spell them. Yeah. And there are a couple of things where I think he's got kind of a Western twang, sure. but I mean, he's from the Carolinas, right? He doesn't come to Tennessee until he's an adult. And And there have been a couple of times where I suspected there was a little Irishness to it, right? His
Yeah.
family comes from Ulster. But that is, yeah, that would be really cool to do.
We've got some great, we're lucky enough, you know, TR being from when he is, we've got some audio recordings of his voice. And so it's fairly high. It's kind of up here and it's very, very articulate, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Which is not what I would expect from TR. I would have thought it would be a
no,
little deeper, a little chustier.
no. And people remark on his high pitched voice basically his whole life. When he's in Harvard, he's in the Glee Club a little while, but not very long. Because his voice is not quite suited for it.
Bless it. But I wonder if that's going back to like childhood illness, like if he had asthma, had issues with like asthma and respiratory illness.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder if that was part of it. So.
I'm sure it was, because for one thing, that never actually totally went away. He grew out of it a little bit, but he struggled with, you know, occasional asthma attacks and bronchitis attacks and other issues like that as long as he lived. So.
Yeah. All right, folks, what other questions have you got for us? They don't have to be about the park lands. They can just be just about the two presidents.
Yeah, anything. David has thought of something. And thank you, Natalie, for being here.
Yep.
We wait patiently to hear what David has thought of. Teddy Roosevelt would love playing Pokemon Go. I agree. That thought would never have occurred to me in a million years, but I am with you. I think he would enjoy getting out there, getting outdoors and cataloging the animals. That's what he did as a kid for real. So yes, I agree with you.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I'm going to think of that randomly now.
Jackson wouldn't have had any patience for that.
Yeah.
Jackson wouldn't have had any patience for Pokemon Go. I think he would have like looked at, you know, people over the age of 16, let's say, you know, doing this kind of stuff when like there's grown folks work to be done, you know.
Yes.
Jackson certainly enjoyed recreation. He danced. He was a big dancer. Really enjoyed music. Loved parties, you know, but the idea of just like a game, if you will, like Pokemon Go, I think would have held very little interest for him.
Yeah. See, TR loved play. We've got a great letter where he's drawn a picture of having a pillow fight with his kids. He loved to play.
Yeah, Jackson's not a player. I think he's certainly energetic and engaged, like physically and mentally. He definitely kind of brings it all in. Yeah. But I think he enjoyed watching young people play, but I think he also found it probably a little hard to be in that setting, if they were going to enjoy themselves, and he was too, because I think he just constantly thinks about the things that have to be done, the goals and the strategies that have to be met. And even there's a story of a Christmas party that happens at the White House in 1836, and the early part of the day, like, you know, and the story is told by his niece who lived there. So the early part of the day, of course, they all get up, they go to church. Jackson gets all the children who are living at the White House, and it's lots of different nieces and nephews, and a couple of the cabinet members' children, and they get together and they go to a local orphanage in Washington, distributing gifts and bringing Christmas cheer to this orphanage. And on the way back, one of the children asks him if he had ever met Santa Claus or Father Christmas. And he said, no, like there was actually, you know, and he tells them this story about a little boy he knew who never knew anything about Santa Claus, you know, and of course he's talking about himself. And so I think partly he's just not quite sure what to do with it. And so it is a day in which like good deeds can be performed, but then it's back to politics, right? It's not a day to take off work. And so later on that evening, after they go to the orphanage, they come back, they have their Christmas dinner, and then they had set up a snowball fight in the East Room of the White House. So it was basically two big stands of cotton bowls that had opened, and they were kind of stacked up like Christmas trees, and the kids got to have a snowball fight in the East Room of the White House while he and the other adults, you know, went and had adult conversations. But they left, you know who they left in charge of the snowball fight? Martin Van Buren. because they were trying to pair Martin Van Buren up with one of the cabinet members' daughters. And so they thought, let's put these two in charge of the kids, which means they'll have to bond together because they're the two adults in the room, and we'll all
Wow.
talk about grown-up stuff.
Man, I want to see that movie. That's great. That's
You're not
Martin
kidding.
Van Buren, Andrew Jackson, like rom-com movie. That'd be great.
Ew, I don't. But no, Jackson was not a scout, not like a Boy Scout. That certainly comes along later. He was a scout in the military, though, and that happened when he was 13, 14 years old, David, to answer your question. So
yes, scouting comes along during TR's time, professional Boy Scouting as we know it now, and he was a big supporter of that movement.
I think Jackson would have been as well.
Yes.
Just the idea that it toughens people up, it equips you with knowledge, and skills to survive, in the wilderness. Yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting to think about what people might have done if they had lived in a different time or had different resources or in a different place. But I have always found, this is just a little pro tip as a historian from me, it's always much more interesting to just watch what's really happening with people. Because then you get a much clearer sense of who they are, what they value, what they like to do, what they're bad at doing, where they're going to succeed, where they're going to fail. It's like reading a character in a book sometimes, right? Like you're getting a sense of all these different facets of their life. So it's always fun to propose ideas about what they might have done or would have done, but what they did do itself is always just remarkably complex and interesting.
Yeah. And like you say, the things they do and the things they didn't do or failed to do can often be an interesting part of it, right? The actions that they tried to take that did not pan out the way they expected, that kind of thing. There's a lot of stories to be told there. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So David, your question, like, isn't that how you learn about them? How part of what you're saying is true. Like you learn about them by asking questions about them, by trying to see how did they solve this problem? How did they go about this? What could they have done that they didn't do? Right? What options? But even then, if you just stay with like the options, you've got to get back to what they really did at some time. So if you just have this whole story in your mind about what would have happened had Andrew Jackson been a Boy Scout, sure, but at some point, like, he wasn't. So we gotta bring this back to how did he learn about the other things that Boy Scouts might have taught him, right? How did he learn these things, and why did he value them?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, by reading about them and their personal accounts. Absolutely. You cannot make up for that, David. There's no there's no way to make up for that knowledge. And I always recommend, I mean, again, this is primary sources, so many famous people, their writings have been published. I read Theodore Roosevelt's book Wilderness Writings, which was just a collection of some of his outdoors articles. And in there, he also in the book included his account of trying to find the mouth of a river in Brazil that they thought the root of it was in the Amazon, but it wasn't. Rio Roosevelt, the river eventually gets named for TR. Yeah. But reading the story of how this happens, it is brutal. I mean, it is just a beastly sort of encounter that they're having. And he's fevered. They're losing all their luggage. Everybody's been injured. There was concern that his son might have died. Like, I mean, it's as arduous as anything a novelist could come up with or a movie maker could come up with. So yeah, absolutely read about them. Yeah, no doubt.
And before we finish up, that does, I'll give a plug for TheodoreRooseveltCenter.org, where all of our primary sources live, our digital library, where you can read, letters and government documents and look at photographs and political cartoons, all kinds of stuff there on our website to learn those personal accounts. So.
And Jacksons are kind of scattered. There are a lot of them are at the National Archives or the Library of Congress. The University of Tennessee at Knoxville is the official Papers of Jackson project. So they are just now getting the papers digitized. So they still don't have the full and they're for his whole life, not just for his presidency. So you can get part of them online still, and the rest of them will be coming online. So
Very
just
good.
got to do the Google. All right. Well,
All
thanks
right.
everybody. Good to be with you today.
Yeah, we're just about at time. So thank you so much for all the questions, everyone, for participating. Really enjoyed the Q&A a lot and learned a lot from this whole session. So thank you to Aaron and William. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good to be with you. Bye, everybody.